2. Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. This is going to be one of the fun segments that I always invite around here. I'm a writer and I'm a reader. Sounds like a Steve Miller song or something, but I have been reading this guy's work since I was young and he was younger. He has a book out, and it's part of sort of this life's work of his Catcher in the Rye, elder statesman-ness of what it's like to be retired and have the cool childhood of growing up in and around sports, rock and roll, cars, and Knights in White Castle. He is Steve Rushin. He's clever. He's a better writer than I am, but I am trying hard. You can find him at Steve Rushin. The new book is out. If you read Stingray Afternoons, you read any of the other stuff that he's worked on, it's now available in hardcover, ebook, audio, and he's always kind enough to make time for the Trans Am that was not Smokey and the Bandits Trans Am for your book. Dude, a pleasure as always. I'm such a fan of yours. I'd sit here and be an idiot and slobber all over you about your writing and all of that, but the first question's first. Inspiration for the book. I mean, you're really at a fun point in your life where you're writing kind of what you want, when you want, and pouring it out there, and people are really digging your work right now.
Well, thanks, Nestor. Yeah, the inspiration for the book came really, like the previous book was a memoir of growing up, in the most innocent time of childhood from age 3 to about age 13, when, your bike is your freedom and you haven't really gotten to high school yet. And this book is a follow-up to that. Teenage years, high school, college, and leaving home. In my case, that was leaving suburban Minneapolis, where I grew up, and going off to college in Milwaukee. I went to Marquette, and then leaving Marquette for New York City, and never having been to New York only once, and kind of trying to make my way there. So
there's my Catcher in the Rye thing, then, right? Huh?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Both. What they have in common is they're both published by Little Brown, and beyond that, I could only hope for Catcher in the Rye like sales, but or literary immortality. But so it's I think something that everybody's experienced, whether they've gone off to college or not. That time when eventually you get kicked out of the house or leave or can't wait to leave. In my case, I didn't really want to leave, and my parents suggested I go to college 5 or 6 hours from home because they knew that I didn't want to get my driver's license. So I think I was, you could say I was a homebody, and I'm glad they kicked me out into the world because I got to see the world, and only when I saw the rest of the world did I see how good I had it growing up in Bloomington, Minnesota. When you grow up where you grew up, that's all you know, and then when you see the rest of the world, you get a better gauge of how you had it as a kid, and man, I had it good in Bloomington.
Boy, it helps to see the world in your writing. I'm an admirer of your writing going on half of my life. But, funny, clever, puns, using words. I have a big vocabulary. I worked very hard on my big vocabulary to be a writer at a newspaper when I was a kid, and I've written books, and I like the way words are put together and the way people choose to put them together. But then there comes do you have any, what do the words mean, and putting them together is a life's journey. And at 50, I would write and think about different things. I think about sports in a different way. I'm doing this Baltimore Positive thing now that's very, very important to me because I live here and I'm one of the older guys now. I'm not the kid at the paper anymore. For you to want to write memoirs and write about this and write about for your audience, because you can write about anything you want. I mean, people would hire you to write all sorts of things if that's where your interests were. But where you are right now in raising your family and writing about this stuff, give me the greater value in all of this, not just in therapy, which all of us writers do for ourselves, right? We write for an audience of ourselves and hope everybody else digs it. But what do you hope to garner to give to the audience in all of this?
Well, there is that aspect of it. I mean, it is therapeutic, that's for sure, and figuring out kind of what your life means, and by looking back on it and trying to organize it into a narrative. Life is often random, and if we can, particularly as writers, make sense of it by putting it into a narrative. This happened because this happened because this happened. It helps us make a little bit of sense of our lives, and it also helps us, I think, bestow gratitude on people that you don't realize had as big of an impact as they did until you look back at some of these seemingly random events that that wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have gotten to Sports Illustrated and had 30 years of traveling the world for them if not for the Jane Wolfe, who hired me over the phone for 3 months when she had no real reason to do so other than some kind of a gut instinct. And so that helps. But I think, the best part of writing and the best part of reading is when you can identify with others and you can make a connection with that writer or with the reader. And I've already had people who have read the book in advance tell me that I had a woman tell me yesterday that her son couldn't wait to leave for college. He left with all this swagger and bravado of, shaking the dust of this crummy little town, as George Bailey said in It's a Wonderful Life, and only confessed a few years later, now that he's a senior in college, that he was really scared. He wanted to stay home, and that's exactly, and that, that was what I expressed in Nights in White Castle, and I mentioned this to somebody else, and they said they felt the same way. So I think when you feel like you're not alone in the world, when you're reading a book and you say, I've had this feeling, I've done that, I've thought this, but I've never wanted to say it to anybody. I think that makes people feel less alone, and I think the best books and the best writing, to put it in one sentence, make people feel less alone.
Well, it's interesting for me. Steve Rushin joining us here. Nights in White Castle's the new book. Author Stingray Afternoons, longtime Sports Illustrated pundit and a guy that made me laugh and chuckle amidst your short form writing. For we sort of know you through a short form of writing, to be able to go first person and all. I've been reading you forever. It was always pop culture. There was always music and bands and cars and sports and places and themes and humor involved in all of that. But to then try to take that into your own personal way and start to write in this way. Did you always sort of write memoir-y stuff back in the day that never saw the light of day, other than whatever couple thousand words I would see in Sports Illustrated in a given week?
It's the first stuff I was writing. I started writing in, say, 4th or 5th grade when my mom finally let me use her big old Royal typewriter, and I would just write stuff for my own amusement in my bedroom. In fact, only for my own amusement. I'd be mortified if anybody ever found it.
Was that white out or the white tape? What did you have to do when you screwed up?
I would use actually white out, and the white tape, that was far too advanced. Plus, I didn't know how to change a ribbon in a typewriter. This was a manual typewriter. Later, with my own money, at a garage sale, I got an electric typewriter that sounded like fireworks when you hit it, and it had the hum of industry when you would turn it on. So I really felt like I was a professional.
It vibrated. You remember it had a little
vibrated.
Yeah,
exactly.
Nice.
From the way my heart did, but I would then crumple up those stories and leave them in my wastebasket. And one day I came home from school, and my mom had uncrumpled the paper and was passing it around to her bridge club, and I was horrified and angry and embarrassed. But they all said complimentary things, so I had my first audience. But a lot of those things that I was writing were just about things I had experienced. Maybe it was an imaginary basketball game I had played in the driveway where you have two opposing teams and they're both you, and you eventually win the game at the buzzer.
I was always Dr. J. Don't ask me why, but it's that Fisher saved Pittsburgh. That was it, man.
Because he existed. Who didn't want to be Dr. J? So I had a Dr. J poster on my bedroom door. I loved the Sixers until Minnesota's own Kevin McHale went to the Celtics, and suddenly I switched overnight from being a Sixers fan to a Celtics fan, which you really shouldn't be allowed to do, but I did, and I did it at the right time in the 80s. But so I'd write stories about that kind of stuff, and I would write stories about Minnesota Twins games I watched on the TV in our basement, but that first stuff was sort of autobiographical stuff. When you're 10 years old and your autobiography consists of about the 5 years that you can remember.
For me, they were always Orioles summers. It's how the Orioles did that year. Was pretty much how my summer went in '79, and it didn't have a happy ending. Steve, you know that? You know what I mean? It wasn't Homer Hanky, believe me.
No, but it had 9/10 of a very happy story, and when your mind is a sponge at that age, and those things make a huge impression. The Twins were terrible in the '70s when I was a kid, and yet Rod Carew, we would put thinly sliced butter pastrami in our cheek, pretending it was a chaw of tobacco, and as we'd read that Carew would stick it in his cheek to tighten his face and pull down the skin under his right eye, the one closest to the pitcher, and we thought that would help us in driveway baseball and in Little League. So those things, 40 years later, I'm still talking about them because they made such an impression on me. And this was for a bad baseball team.
Dude,
So
I still take
imagine
the rocks out of the batter's box when I'm pretending to be Ken Singleton, okay? So, like, I got the same disease. I mean, we all have it, you know?
I didn't grow up anywhere near Baltimore. I'd never been to Baltimore, and I was, anytime it rained, we would be doing the Rick Dempsey slide into home plate during the rain delay. I mean, if you could, as a kid, know what the Baltimore Orioles did during their rain delays. I mean, this was at a time when baseball had a bigger cultural footprint nationally than it does now. And you would watch This Week in Baseball, and these guys were national characters in a big national drama. Now people say, well, Mike Trout, what people would recognize him on the street. It doesn't make him any less of a great player. It's just the way childhood and entertainment has shifted. There were 9 things that you watched when we were kids, and there's 9,000 things you can watch now.
As Mel Allen would say, how about that? Steve Rushin here, Knights in White Castle. You can find him out at Steve Rushin on Twitter as well as the book. And, I get into all the nerdity of, like, Dr. J and me being a kid covering him when he was playing for the Sixers and all this crazy stuff that happened. You and I would go beer for beer on all of that stuff, but more on the writing side. And short form versus long form, fiction versus fact, what we're teaching our kids and where the basis of reading and writing, and that you would hope to sell a bunch of books, but you'll still sell less than you really thought you were going to sell because people don't read as many books as they used to read. And we go through all of this, and I wonder if I'm ever going to write another book because I don't know that people are reading them, that I feel like I've always been such a long, loquacious, 4-hour radio guy with plenty of air to say what I want to say. I find it very difficult to go back and write in 10 and 12-inch columns. You know what I mean? Like the way you did at Sports Illustrated, that you don't have to be restricted to that anymore. That, hey, this is, I got 18 inches of copy and I've got X amount of words and that's what I have. That the internet has allowed all of us to sort of be unedited and sort of Reddit long form, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. And that's, the old Mark Twain, I'm writing you a long letter because I didn't have time to write you a short letter. Can be much harder to write 800 words in which every sentence and every transition and every word has to have meaning. But, the best books and the best long-form writing, you take that same care with, 90,000 words that you do with 800 words. At least I try to. Of course, you have a longer deadline, so you have longer time to do that. But, writing columns, I felt very, I loved doing them, but I felt a lot of pressure to make every word sing, and I'd have a week to write 800 words, which is too much time for that, but you'd spend too much time on that. And then, writing longer pieces of 5, 6, 7,000 words for the magazine, I feel like I was a dog let off a leash in the park, and I could kind of, not in the writing, not in the, every word and paragraph and transition you still try to make count, but you can go down different avenues, different digressions, different diversions, see where this is going to go, and then bring it back at the end to make it all make sense. It's just more experimental, and then writing books. The books that I've written have almost all started out as a blank page, and then 800 words, and then end up with 5,000 words, give it to an agent and circulates to publishers. We'd like to see 5,000 more words on this, and then when you get these 10,000 words, now you've got a book idea, and you have to write 80,000 more words. So, it's one foot in front of the other, where everything starts out as an 800-word column, and sometimes that's enough, and you've exhausted that idea. Sometimes you feel like you can go 5,000 words. Sometimes it's a book. But if it's going to be a book, you have to make sure it's something that you want to sit down every single day excited to write about. Otherwise, it's drudgery. And as you say, fewer people read books. You don't know if there will be an audience for this. Oftentimes, you don't know until the book is out there. But if it's something you feel passionate about and something that you want to get off your chest, I think it's worth writing if you're able to do it, whether there's going to be a big audience or a small one, because oftentimes that isn't even up to you. It's up to other circumstances. So just write the best book you can, and that's what I try to do while hedging my bets, hoping that it sells.
Well, I've become such a snob, right? I mean, as a writer myself, I'm very critical of poor writing. When something's poorly written, I can tell within 3 paragraphs, sort of like an English teacher would be. I've said this many times. I can say this. I have an FCC license. I call myself a prickfectionist. I'm angry that it's not perfect, and I don't mean in like a headline in the New York Times that they get the tone wrong about the president or whatever. I mean just in general, it's very hard for me to follow along on social media if you don't conjugate verbs, if you don't use semicolons and periods and spell things appropriately in a world where everything is spell checked. And I guess that's my cross to bear in all of that the value of good writing is still really important to me, that if you're not a good writer, it's hard for me to take you seriously. I need to put the video on then. You need to communicate with me in a different way. And I guess the real circle of this is, I was going to ask you about your children, quite frankly, and how does a writer raise children on reading and teaching children how to read and write early on? I would think that would have been an incredible thing for you to have done at that point in your life, to be a parent and try to teach your children the value of reading. We all should be reading in our culture, but what are we reading? Fact, fiction, truth, poor writing. I grew up where everything was sort of edited, so my eyes see mistakes very quickly, and I weed out, let's say, Russian bots pretty quickly, Steve.
I'm exactly the same way you are, and as far as my children go, they made me in Cape Cod a couple of summers ago buy a T-shirt that we saw hanging in a store window that I wear frequently, and it says, "I'm silently correcting your grammar." And the kids,
because you are, and I am too.
Well, they should say you should tape over the silently part, because I'm usually loudly correcting their grammar.
No, I don't do that anymore. No, I got tape over my mouth, Steve. It's over.
Well, my parents did the same thing, and we have the luxury of having a lot of books in the house, and we have a bunch of great libraries a 5-minute drive away, and we're there often, and I read my 10-year-old son most nights when he goes to bed, and it started out as a delaying tactic. I don't want to go to bed now. Can you read? Can we read? And
as every parent relationship has from the time we read to our kids, right? Everybody read.
Absolutely.
My father read to me.
We still read, and
my father read The Bronx Zoo to me in 1979. Does that mean
that's brilliant,
right? I mean, literally read it out loud. It's true.
He was able to enjoy it.
I probably changed a few words.
Of course, yeah. Sitting on the birthday cake, naked, probably didn't get edited while he was reading it as a bedtime story.
See, when he took me to see Semi-Tough or Network or, Bad News Bears, the Assume was never edited out back. You know what I mean? Like all of those childhood things that we did. Right. I mean, you couldn't edit Kelly Leak, so.
No, and it was sort of a window into a more grown-up or older kid world. And, at least my parents in the 70s and early 80s, they didn't want to have a heart-to-heart conversation about this kind of stuff. So if you send your kid to Bad News Bears, and they learn a little street wisdom, at least fake movie street wisdom that they might not have had when they went in.
My dad was very proud of the Mac Davis, Nick Nolte scene. He had no problem with that in North Dallas 40,
And Walter Matthau in the Bad News Bears is getting hammered on Coors.
It was a light beer,
at the kids.
Yeah, right. It wasn't like an IPA or anything.
yeah. Well, he was also drinking it while driving and throwing the empties in the back of the car. But in 1976 or whenever that was, as a 9-year-old, I just thought, wow, I've never had a coach like this, but this must be how it is in California, where everything is more advanced. And my dad took me to Jaws the summer it came out, and I was terrified to see it. Of course I was. I was 9, and the first scene is a skinny dipper getting eaten by a shark, and there were two things that I hadn't seen. Now 10 seconds into Jaws, I have, and it blew my mind. And my dad kind of sat there eating popcorn and laughing at the rubber shark, but I was traumatized. But that's kind of how we learned stuff in 1975.
Yeah, if I ever interviewed your wife, I'd say something clever about basketball and high five. If I ever talked to Tatum O'Neal, I'd ask her if she had Tommy John. I'd find out later on because
right.
Teaching the cutter at 11, right?
Right, exactly. Now they'd have a pitch count on her, and she never would have gotten in there.
Steve Rushin is our guest. He's got a book. You should go buy it because all of his writing's brilliant. Nights in White Castle is the book. If you read Stingray Afters, what else do you do besides chase your kids around and do funny things? My wife asked me about you. I said, you and your wife do like sort of the kind of podcast me and my wife would do. We're just sort of like have fun and like tell stories and whatever. And you've lived on such a public stage and doing the book, and hopefully it sells well and all that. But on a day-to-day basis, how much writing are you doing that isn't like about the next book or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, it sounds horrible now that I'm saying it out loud for the first time, but I do almost no writing that isn't for potential, work. I would probably be better off if I did. I make notes in the notebook, random thoughts, and
Billy Joel doesn't write music anymore, too, dude. You gotta stop this. You know what I mean? Mick Jagger's still shaking his ass and singing. Yeah. Keith Richards is still playing a guitar. Steve Rushin needs to be writing. Come on.
I am writing, but the thing when you're writing books is they don't come out for a year and a half or 2 years.
Just make me laugh on Twitter more often, okay? Please.
Well, I will do that. I promise you, I will do that. That's the ultimate short form writing, the 100, 200 and whatever characters it is now. And that's another thing, when you were alluding earlier to grammar and spelling and stuff, I think our kids live in a world where, spelling was so devalued and kind of, I still try to send texts that are punctuated and have capital letters where capital letters should be and spelling out words and whatnot. And kids think, of course, that's ridiculous. And most of the grown-ups now that I get texts from, it's the same thing. 19 exclamation marks, for after a thank you or something seems a little over the top. But now if I just write thank you, period, it seems insufficient. But no. So I seldom go a day or more than a couple of days without writing anything. But they're just pieces that appear less frequently. So and I enjoy that. I feel like I'm able to. I'm building a staircase or something as a carpenter, instead of just whittling a stick into a sharper stick.
I need you to be funny for me. There's plenty that's not out there. So, hey, good luck with the book, man. And I love memoirs, and it always inspires me to write down all the cool, fun stuff. I've even made some notes here while we're chatting. But hope the book does well. You're doing a little tour, right? You're getting around a little bit and having some fun telling these stories, right?
Yep, I'm wherever people will have me. I will go and tell some of these stories, and I expect particularly people who grew up in places that have White Castles will identify with some of the stories in the book.
Well, I've told you about this on text. There's a song called White Castle Blues. My buddy's in the Smithereens. It was a B-side that never made the album. So it wasn't on the album, but if you bought the audio tape, not the 8-track, because it was a little later than that, or the CD, you got the bonus track later on Especially For You. It's called White Castle Blues. It's all about eating White Castle at 2 in the morning and, sort of, it wasn't even like a stoner reference as much as it was like a drinking Jersey 1970s reference. I am not a White Castle fan. I sort of make fun of it in a sort of vomitory way. But when
there's a vomit reference in the Smithereens song.
Oh, correct. So the Smithereens, when they get together now, and I was at one of their final shows before Pat passed away, and I've been friends with those guys for 35 years. White Castle actually sponsored their reunion charity show. Jimmy Babjack, the author of White Castle Blues, he lost his wife to cancer, Betty. She was a family friend, and we went up for this big event. And literally at midnight when the show happened, they delivered like 1,000 White Castle burgers, and they were throwing them out there in the song. And we all literally, I have video of this, eating White Castle had never tasted as good. They did something special to it that night, Steve. I mean, it was warm, it was delicious, it was juicy, it was tasty. It didn't make me sick the next day. It was awesome, you know. So I'm back on maybe trying White Castle. I'm thinking about it, you know.
It's all about context. They're certainly way better after midnight, and bar closing time is really when they most come alive.
Well, thank God for that. Steve, be well. Congrats on the book, and I hope, I've never met you. I think we were in the same room at the same time. I don't know if ever, were you at the Sports Illustrated 1999 anniversary 21st century thing with all the Ali, everybody was there. Were you at that thing at the Garden in New York?
I was at that thing, and it was the first time that and everybody, you're right, from the 20th century in sports was there. It was crazy. It was like
Is it the most amazing thing you've ever attended, from that kind of percent? Because it still is for me, and I've done 30 Super Bowls, dude. I mean, I've been around a little bit, but I've never been anywhere where there's that much juice in the same room, ever.
It was crazy, but and it was like a 50s diner where they have James Dean and Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley and all these people, crowded into a painting. It was like that in real life for sports in the 20th century. But my favorite memory of that night, the Olympic hockey team was there, Muhammad Ali was there, and everybody you could think of was there. But my favorite memory, in hindsight, was at this little reception afterwards in another room at Madison Square Garden. I invited my brother in from Chicago that night to be my plus one. He went over to the hors d'oeuvre table and kind of looked back at me and pointed at somebody also at this hors d'oeuvre table, and he stood up to his full 6'2" height and tried to measure himself against this woman, Rebecca Lobo, who 4 years later I had never met, but 4 years later Rebecca and I would get married. And when I told her this story of my brother Jim and I seeing her at that Sports Illustrated event, and my brother measuring himself surreptitiously next to her, she said, "God, I hate it when people do that." And I can always tell when they're doing that. He was one of those guys. And
that's changed the relationship with her brother-in-law, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Well, my other brother, another one of my brothers, the first time he met her, she went to give him a hug goodbye after we were in Minnesota for a couple of days, and he pulled out of the hug and said, No, I don't hug low. I refuse to be the low party in a hug, and he's a couple inches shorter than she is, so she had to kind of crouch down, and he had to go high while she went, low under the armpit. So. Well,
she no doubt has a sense of humor, right? I mean, we figured that. So you met her that night, or you just saw her and left her alone?
Oh, we didn't talk to her. We saw her and left her alone, and
So when he was measuring himself, he was looking at you like you have no shot, dude. Was that where this was?
Yeah. No, I wasn't thinking about having any kind of shot. We would later, a couple of years later, meet randomly in a bar in New York. But I remember that night standing there with members of the 1980 Olympic hockey team and Al Michaels, talking to Al Michaels about the Miracle on Ice with my brother, who was a hockey player in Providence, played in the Frozen Four and stuff. And I just thought, it doesn't get any better than this. If you grew up a sports fan and, were 13 years old in 1980 and, watched that in Minnesota where half the team was from, this was one of those peak life moments.
Steve, I took the month of July off. I've been doing this 21 years at the station, 29 years, and the Orioles are in last place. And, I'm doing this Baltimore positive thing. My city's been getting kicked around. I took the month of July just to celebrate our anniversary off, and I found all of my Hall of Fame interviews. Every baseball player I've ever interviewed in 29 years. I found Rod Carew, Mike Schmidt, all sorts of stuff. Football, I did 70 or 80 of those. But in doing this, I found the night that I was at that event. And somehow I got invited. It was right before I was nationally syndicated, and I was doing my own thing, and we were in one of the glass rooms there, and they were delivering people to us. I have literally all of it on audio tape because that's what we used at the time, and I have all the pictures, right? So I had on my show in one night Carl Lewis, Mike Eruzione, Sir Roger Bannister, who died last year. Bonnie Blair came by. Roger Clemens was there. Bobby Valentine was there. Jason Sehorn came. So Peter King, who's one of my dear. Evander Holyfield. All these people came by. But my enduring memory of all of it is I had a producer there. We were all in tuxedos, trying to look like we were bigger shots. And you remember it was like the bowels of the Garden on the 5th floor underneath. There's cables hanging. There's the Zamboni Boney's in the corner, and everybody's in a tuxedo, and there's Tiger Woods, and there's... So my buddy comes in, my producer, was really my buddy, comes in with Martina Navratilova. And he, just brings her in. And she sits down and she grabs the headset. And I have all of this. I ran all of this in July because I found the tapes, They were like the missing tapes. And she sat down and she said, the only reason I sat here is he promised me free water and that I'd be left alone. And she did 10 minutes of brilliant, deadpan, funny. And she got up. And maybe this speaks to your wife and your wife's tallness. And maybe you saw her and were very attracted to her but were afraid of her or whatever. I had always rooted against Martina. Did you root for or against Martina? Be honest.
No, she was through no doing of her own, because she was exceptional both as an athlete and as a person, but as a kid and tennis fan.
You rooted for Chris Evert.
She was a villain.
You rooted for Chris Evert, right, of course. So all of this goes on, and now she's next to me. We do 10 minutes. Dude, she was as cool a person as anybody who's ever sat next to me, and funny and whatever. She got up, she left, she took her water, and all three of us, there were three of us, me and Andy, who grew up in Syracuse, Scott, we're all the same age. They all read your work. We're all pals. They grew up in Harrisburg. We all looked at each other and said, oh, my God, I have a crush on Martina. She was so beautiful. Her skin was... She was beautiful, and we had this crush on her, and 20 years later, we still talk about the mad crush we had on Martina Navratilova. So I'm going to leave you with that, because I do remember being in the same room with you that night and leaving you alone and grabbing all these other people. But one day, I want to have a beer with you. I want to have a beer in the nights in White, and maybe a White Castle with you at some point.
We will do that for sure.
It's on my bucket list. I mean, it's totally on my bucket list, man. Maybe we could do it out of a can in front of the Rod Carew statue near Target or something.
If not there, we'll do it in Baltimore. I love Baltimore, and keep up your campaign to the love of Baltimore.
Keep up your campaign to make me laugh and keep me reading books. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Nestor.
Steve Rushin, Nights in White Castle, author of Stingray Afternoons, hearing my stupid old stories about the night he first saw his wife at a buffet. So it gives us both a chance to tell stupid stories, which I think we could do all day. You can follow him on Twitter. Go buy his books, Nights in White Castle, the way to do that. Find me out on the interweb, nasty at WNST.net, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking about writers and writing and nonfiction and all sorts of good stuff at WNST.net.